Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for the 2020 Annual Report on Market Issues and Performance. Throughout today's presentation, we will pause for questions. If you wish to ask a question over the phone, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before asking your question. If you wish to ask your question via the chat, please direct it to all panelists via the chat drop-down menu. The report and other materials can be found using the links on the presentation. Calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meeting. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. With that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Amelia. Amelia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, everybody, for calling in today. This is a presentation of our annual report on market issues and performance for 2020. I think I say this at the beginning of every report presentation, but my name may be on the presentation. It is the work of a very dedicated team of people in the Department of Market Monitoring. The report this year comes in at just under 300 pages and has an incredibly well thought through, I think, and in-depth analysis of the market in 2020. I would encourage you to read it. I will be able to cover just a portion of it today. We're very happy to take questions on the report, both during the presentation today and outside of the presentation. If you do have a question about the report, or anything else related to that, please feel free to send an email to either myself or the Department of Market Monitoring. There are two links at the bottom of the screen. The first is to the annual report for 2020, and the second is to our website. Our website has a section that has, in addition to all of the annual reports, quarterly reports, monthly reports, also has a number of special reports that may be of interest to you. In response to a stakeholder request, we extended the presentation today to 2 hours. We usually reserve about 1 hour. I don't plan to take the entire 2 hours, but I am happy to stop for questions along the way. So please do either use the chat, as Adam mentioned, or feel free to ask a question over the phone. And with that, I will kick off. Before I actually show you any of our market results, I'm going to say a few things. There are a few themes this year that really come through a number of the different metrics that we do on a regular basis. I think of writing these annual reports really as writing the history. The economic history of our market. And a couple of the things that, if you think about 2020, the themes that come through, one is the occurrence of load curtailment in 2020, really for the first time in 20 years when we think back. And I think the other event in 2020 that's really unique is the quarantine stay-at-home measures and the impact those COVID-related quarantine stay-at-home measures had on a number of different features of our market. In addition, there are some longer-term changes that we see impacting the market in a number of different ways. One is a shift in the entities which are serving load within the state of California. If you go back to 2015, according to a recent CPUC ruling, about 2% of load in the state of California was served by community choice aggregators. Moving up to 2021, that's jumped all the way up to 30%. With that shift, we've seen a decrease in the amount of long-term power purchase agreements, so those long-term capacity contracts, which really provided a basis for a lot of the competitive bidding that we've seen in our market. In addition, And we're seeing a shift in the generation resources which are included in the market, a shift to renewables, essentially from gas and other thermal resources. A lot of that has to do with state mandates that are designed to be responsive to, for instance, carbon emission reduction. And some of that, we're also seeing an impact in terms of the kind of weather extremes, which are becoming more common in the market footprint, especially across the wider energy imbalance market footprint. So we'll see some of those impacts as well, drought and fire risk particularly. So with that, I will move on. This is our total ISO wholesale energy cost. That is the total cost to California ISO load, which increased by about 3%. That is a 19% increase, so a higher increase after accounting for lower natural gas costs. Within the ISO, the all-in cost for gas, which includes the greenhouse gas cost, fell by about 15.7% on a load-weighted basis. This chart in the blue line, we are showing nominal costs in the blue bars. In the green line, we are showing our average daily natural gas price, including the greenhouse gas adjustment. And in the yellow line, we're showing in the yellow bar, we're showing the normalized all-in cost. When we look and see what that is made up of, we can see that as in prior years, most of the California ISO wholesale cost is composed of day-ahead energy costs. If we go back to 2016 and prior, we see that that makes up about 95% of the total cost. Moving forward to 2020, it's fallen over this 5-year period, and in 2020 we find that the day-ahead energy cost is only about 91% of the total cost. More of that is coming from an increase in real-time energy costs, which include, as noted on the table here, include costs for flexible ramping product. That flexible ramping product is most often priced at zero and doesn't make up the majority of that real-time energy cost at $1.64. The other component of these costs, which increased particularly this year, is the reserve, ancillary service, and RUC. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the ancillary service slide. All-in costs this year were $8.9 billion, $42 per megawatt hour, up from about $8.7 billion in 2019. This chart shows our average quarterly prices going back to 2018. The day-ahead price is in blue, the 15-minute real-time price is in yellow, and the 5-minute price is in green. This year, as last year, our 15-minute and day-ahead prices were fairly close. There was fairly good convergence between those two, but we do tend to see lower 5-minute prices, which are lower than both the day-ahead and the 15-minute. One of the factors that we find is a big driver for overall costs is natural gas prices. Natural gas resources tend to be on the margin, and when natural gas prices go up in one area, natural gas resources bidding in their marginal costs in that area can actually set the price over the entire system. What we're showing here are average monthly natural gas prices in 5 hubs. Henry Hub in the dark blue along the bottom there is the national index, and we're comparing that to PG&E Citygate. In yellow, SoCal Citygate. In brick red, El Paso Permian. In the light green there, and Northwest Sumas. As you look back over 2019, you can see that there was a large increase in gas prices in early 2019, and the same could be said in the early months of 2021, which are not shown on this chart. Overall, in 2020, what we found is that natural gas prices were down across the ISO footprint, and were also lower in the northwestern part of our energy imbalance market. You can keep this chart in mind. I will move down to our next chart. I find it useful to put these next to each other. It's easy to see the correlations. If you look back again to 2019, which was a fairly moderate year in a number of ways, what you can see is that in February, we've got high monthly average prices in the bilateral market for the peak package hours at mid-C, mid-Columbia, shown in the chart on a monthly average in light blue, and then also higher prices across the system there. So Palo Verde, which is the major hub in the Southwest, shown in yellow, and Pacific Gas and Electric in the ISO shown in the dark dash, and Southern California Edison also in the ISO for the same average peak hours shown in the light gray. For 2020, what we see is that there was an increase in prices both at Palo Verde and in Southern California, as well as PG&E in August, and that increase in prices was not driven by high natural gas prices. It was instead driven by high regional demand. I don't think I have a slide for this point, but I'll make this point later. In August, during the load curtailment period, part of what was very unusual was the widespread nature across the market footprint of that high temperature, high load condition that really drove that price spike. This is a good time to stop for questions. If there are any questions on the chat or on the phone, if you let me know.
Nothing at the chat at the moment.
All right, and just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, it is #2 on your telephone keypad if you wish to ask a question over the phone. All right, and I do not see any questions in the phone queue at this time.
Okay, moving on. Excluding EIM, we found that net imports were actually static in 2020, but shifted in location, which isn't shown on the chart, from the southwest to the northwest, which is consistent with the pricing that we just saw on the other chart. This chart shows imports and exports in blue for the day-ahead market and in yellow for the 15-minute market. The net interchange before EIM is shown in the black dotted line, and the net interchange after EIM is shown in the solid gray line. These are shown on a average hourly basis by quarter, with the quarters compared to the same quarter in the prior year. So the first panel here is comparing 2019 Q1 to 2020 Q1, and the next panel is Q2, Q3, and so on. One of the patterns I'd like to point out is really the increase in exports that we did see in Q3 of 2020. And one of the other features that we really did have seen a consistent pattern of is an overall decrease in average load. This table on the bottom is showing our annual total energy for the California ISO in gigawatt hours. The next line is showing average load, which went down about 1.7% in 2020. The figure on the top and the final two columns in the table below are showing peak load. So what we've seen in the data is that as our average loads are falling, our peak load increased from 2019. A number of charts in the report, and if you're interested, I encourage you to dig into that. This is one of them. This is comparing the average hourly load for 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. One of the things you can see is the impact of higher behind-the-meter solar generation, which you can see in the chart as the reduction across that 4-year period pretty consistently across the peak solar generation hours, which are in the middle of the day. One of the other things that happened in 2020 particularly were COVID-19 related load reductions. This began in March of 2020 and extended through the remainder of the year. The ISO published a number of very interesting counterfactual studies early in this quarantine period, looking at the particular effect of the stay-at-home measures. What they found, which is consistent with the change we're seeing in the average load, is that the stay-at-home measures appear to have reduced demand in the early part of the workday, so hours ending 9, 10, and 11, but sometimes increase demand in the peak hours of ending 19 and 20. Another impact on load this year was higher statewide temperatures overall. Behind all of that, there are energy efficiency initiatives which continue to have an impact. One of the other factors that has a major impact on the market as a whole is the availability of hydroelectric generation. In 2020, hydroelectric generation decreased to around 8% of supply compared to 14% in 2019, 10 in 2018, and 15% in 2017. The chart on the left side of your screen is showing average monthly hydro generation in the ISO market. And the chart on the right is showing the total hydro production in gigawatt hours going back to 2010. The table is showing the April 1st snowpack as a percent of normal. In 2020, we started out with only 50% of our typical snowpack, and you can see that our average hydro generation was fairly low for the year. I will say that, and we're in August already of 2021, and what we've seen in 2021 is lower average monthly hydro generation in every month of 2021 so far, with the exception of March. This has a major impact on prices in our market, as our hydro generation tends to be towards the bottom of the bid stack. One of the ways that we typically look at prices is on an average hourly basis, and we do that because of the impact of online renewable resources, both wind and solar. The red dashed line here is showing what we call net load. That is our total system load minus utility scale wind and solar. And the solid lines are showing prices: blue, day-ahead, yellow, 15-minute, and green, 5-minute. As in prior years, you can see that the average hourly prices are closely following the net load curve. That's been the case for a number of years now, and you can also see, unlike in 2019, actually, that our 15-minute prices and day-ahead prices are fairly close across all hours. One of the other things I'll note is that our net load in the middle of the day is lower than our lowest load in the early morning hours. So our load at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning is higher on a net load basis than our load is in the middle of the day. That is because of the impact of relatively low-cost solar generation, which is available when its fuel source is available across those hours in the middle of the day. This chart is showing average hourly generation by fuel type in 2020. And as you can see, we have a very distinct pattern of solar generation. You can see some adjustment from the other flexible sources of generation, particularly hydro shown in dark blue, which is generating more in the peak load hours, but more flexibility coming from both imports in the dark red and particularly from natural gas in light blue. Overall, across the system, we've seen a retirement of gas capacity. And as that natural gas fuel capacity has retired, it has been replaced with renewables, predominantly solar. This chart shows the total capacity registered as participating and active in the CAISO BA as of June 1st of each year. So we're including 2021. A couple points to note here. One, the total natural gas shown here in light blue has been falling since 2014, but was fairly stable between 2020 and 2021, and I'll explain that on the next chart. That has been replaced by both solar predominantly, as well as in the last 2 years, we've seen an increase in demand response, shown here in the kind of brick red at the top of each column, and particularly in going into the summer of 2021. So going into this summer, we're seeing an increase in the availability of storage, so batteries coming online, shown in purple at the top of the column on the far right of your screen. When we look at the capacity leaving the CAISO market, and here withdrawal is kind of an awkward word, but it's the word that we're stuck with. We're including anything that is exiting being an active market participant. So this can include capacity that is on either permanently retiring or being repowered or in a mothball status. Going back to 2017, leading up to that, what we see is retirement predominantly of natural gas, again shown in light blue. Prior to the summer of 2021, there was over 4 gigawatts of planned retirements, but as shown in the chart, OTC, so that stands for once through cooling, extension for a number of natural gas resources, as well as RMR, which stands for reliability must run contracting, shown on the chart in orange, allowed those, created the conditions for those resources to actively stay in the market. to be available to create, to meet load this summer, the summer of 2021. When we look at the capacity that's been added to the market on the right-hand side of your screen, what we see is mostly solar, shown in yellow over the last few years, followed by, going into the summer of 2020, some repowered gas capacity. So if you, it won't work because I'm in presentation mode, you can see that almost all of the capacity that retired before the summer of 2020 came back as repowered natural gas capacity. Not quite all. We also saw some additional batteries and wind resources, but going into the summer of 2021, we see that most of the additional capacity coming online has been battery resource. I have a few slides talking about batteries. I'll just pause for a moment if there are any questions on the phone or in the chat.
Nothing in the chat.
And I do not see any questions waiting in the phone queue at this time.
All right, thank you. I included a lot of slides in the presentation on batteries just because we've been getting so many questions about their participation. This chart is showing the maximum duration, so the megawatt hours of the fleet in each year. You can see a growth in 2020, as well as the total discharge capacity above the x-axis shown in the dark blue, and the charging capacity is shown in the light blue. So a dramatic increase going into 2020. This will be a more exciting chart next year. When we look at average schedules, which is what's shown on this chart, what we see is that the discharging shown at the bottom in dark yellow and the charging shown in the light yellow on an average hourly basis for the year is much less than the participation in our regulation ancillary services market. The dark blue we're showing reg up schedules, and in the light blue we're showing reg down schedules. The green, olive green on the top is showing spinning reserves, and the flex up and flex down are shown in the lighter flex up in the darker green at the top. I saw a question just pop up in the chat, but I can't see it. Would you mind reading that for me, Jennifer?
Sure, let me unmute myself. It says, page 16, is there data showing hourly regulation up-down energy dispatch by resource type? And also another question on that, is there a breakdown for slide 16 on the high need, high price days?
Thank you. I believe that question comes from David Francis.
David Francis,
also
and Michael Kessler.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I do not have a chart in the report showing the, I'm thinking back. I think I have a chart in the report showing the fuel breakdown on, but I don't believe it's on an average hourly basis for ancillary services, and I'd be happy to share that. If it doesn't go into enough detail, then we can, if you have a question, please do send it to me separately, and we'll see about potentially publishing that in a future report. Performance of storage resources on the particularly high load days, which I think was the second question, was included in a special report that BMM issued on the high load period, and that is available on our website.
Okay, I also actually have another question from Michael Keto. Has this changed for 2021 looking at the battery chart published each day, it looks like the battery discharge has topped 1,200 megawatts.
That's exactly. So we have had such an increase in our storage capacity in the market that yes, we've seen a substantial change in the standard dispatch on average for storage resources. Our total regulation requirements they change day to day, but are below 500 megawatts. So if total storage capacity is above 1,000, which it is, and we saw an additional, we're up to about 1,600 megawatts of storage capacity, you'd expect that that it would not be able to be discharged as much for regulation. We do see more discharge of that this year in 2021.
Okay, sorry, and there's one more. Wholesale, are these megawatts NQC or installed capacity for renewables? Page 13.
Oh, this is from Wholesale at SCE. This is the total registered capacity by what's called PMAX, which is the maximum generation capacity in the ISO's master file. So this is for natural gas resources. This tends to be equal to their NQC, depending on the deliverability. But for solar, wind, other resources, it's substantially higher than their NQC. These numbers are also based on the PMAX of the resource rather than the NQC. NQC is net qualifying capacity, and that really defines the capacity that can be sold as resource adequacy. It's available to serve resource adequacy requirements. This chart is showing our average hourly battery bids and nodal prices in the day-ahead market at the top and in the real-time market on the bottom, going back to Q3 of 2019. This is showing them on an average hourly basis, going all the way up to the end of 2020. What we see in this chart is a change in bidding behavior and the average bid to discharge, which went up in the beginning of Q3 in 2020. We are comparing that average bid to discharge in yellow to the average bid to charge, which is in green, and the nodal price. And that is the average price at nodes at which these storage resources are located and are bidding in the average when the bidding behavior is being shown on this chart. So what you can see here is that, in Q3 we had prices that really were high enough for that storage resources to be discharged in the day-ahead market and be scheduled to discharge in the day-ahead market. And that was less the case in our real-time market in the bottom panel. And I'll talk through this slide and then pause again for questions because I'm sensing an interest in storage. One of the most exciting things in the annual report this year is that we included net market revenue calculations for new battery energy storage. This is taking a theoretical resource with some characteristics that we define in the report and allowing that, sort of setting that resource up at particular nodes. Here we're doing that on a system basis and then in a number of local areas. And then in the first scenario, scenario one, we're allowing that storage resource to bid in for energy arbitrage only, and assuming that the prices would be whatever the prices happen to be, so that they have no impact on prices. and then looking at the net market revenues in kilowatt years. And in the second scenario, we're allowing those resources also to bid in and receive dispatches for regulation. The first big point I would like to make is that the reason we included the second scenario is that we're seeing the dispatch so much for regulation, but also because, as you can tell, the net market revenues are significantly higher when the resources are allowed to bid in and receive regulation awards. We're seeing net market revenues over $100 per year in the system as a whole and in each of the local areas. The other point I'll make on this is that in both scenario 1 and scenario 2, we see spatial differences. So particularly high net market revenues in the LA Basin, for example, and in some of the southern local areas, and then lower market revenues in some of the northern. One of the charts, and this used to be our most popular chart in the report that we produce on a regular basis, is estimated net revenue for a hypothetical combined cycle unit. This went up in 2020 compared to 2019, and what we see in the green bar at the bottom of the chart is that this unit located in SP15, dispatched against day-ahead prices as a combined cycle, would have received enough net energy market revenues to cover our estimates of going forward fixed costs, which are shown in a range in the yellow bar at the bottom of the screen. We include above net energy market revenues a blue bar as the ISO's soft offer cap price. That's the soft offer cap for capacity, backstop capacity, as a representation of the possible capacity market revenues, which would be needed to meet the estimated levelized fixed cost target. And that higher orange line there is really the all-in cost for building a new resource. When we look at the same chart for a hypothetical combustion turbine, we also see an increase in net energy market revenues in both NP15 and ST15 up to a level, and actually beyond that level in ST15 of going forward fixed costs, here shown in orange. But both, even with the ISO's sort of soft offer cap below the estimated cost of, including financing, of building a new CT. Just to compare between sort of resource types, the estimated net market revenues are about $27 in the north, $42 in the south for a CT, $24 and $44, so pretty close for a CC, a combined cycle. And then going back to our battery resources, we get for energy arbitrage numbers that are in line with the lower values than for the northern gas resources. And once we include regulation, net energy market revenues that far exceed either of the gas resource types. This is a good time to stop for any additional questions before I move on to discussing some of the energy imbalance market.
We do have some from the chat. Going back to page 18 from David Francis. What is DMM's estimate of estimated levelized fixed cost target for battery energy storage? For example, information similar to page 19 and 20.
Thank you, Dave. That's a good question. We did not include going forward fixed cost for our storage resources the way we did here for gas. The estimated levelized fixed cost target that we cite here is based on Energy Commission study, and we did not have the same source for our storage resources.
I'm going to skip one question from Callie and go to David because he refers to page 19 and 20 again. How many megawatts of annual CPM were committed at the soft offer cap price in 2020?
I will hold that question, Dave, because I don't have that written down and in front of me at the minute. So thanks for that. We did have some local CPMs in 2020, and I do not recall the exact megawatt value there. Is there another question from Callie?
From Callie, yeah. How do you determine the bids to charge and discharge for scenario 1, likewise for scenario 2? How do you determine the energy and regulation offers? Also, how do you have a sense of how often and how much regulation the resource was awarded in scenario 2? I think that's probably a slide or two back.
Yeah, that's this slide. We used so in the ISO's ESDR energy storage and distributed energy resource initiative right now. There's been quite a lot of discussion of the development around the development of a default energy bid for storage, and DMM used a calculation based on the proposed default energy bid as a reasonable sort of marginal cost-based bidding strategy for these resources, and use that for both energy and regulation.
Okay, and let's see. I have from Michael Castellano. Is there any way to account for increased GHG from using storage for AS?
Is there a way
to account for increased GHG from using storage for AS? I'm sorry, I don't know what AS is.
So Mike is asking if we are using non-emitting storage resources and so Mike, please text if I get this wrong. If we're not using non-emitting storage resources for ancillary services, essentially holding that capacity back as AS, ancillary services, is that leading to an increase in emissions relative to a counterfactual world in which the storage resources were not available? That really depends on what kind of supply the storage resources are displacing. And Mike, as I'm sure you know, all resources within the state line of California. Mike is texting me on my phone on the side. Have to include have to participate in the state's cap and trade program. Mike is asking about the emissions associated with charging storage resources and whether we account for that in greenhouse gas emissions. That's an interesting question, Mike. Thank you for posing it, and we will give that some thought.
Okay, and let me see. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Is it Sumya? Do you expect the AS profit to decrease with all the additions?
That's a question. We do expect that when we run the same analysis next year that we won't see the same kind of profit available from regulation, partially because the total fleet of storage has completely saturated the regulation market. So we would expect to see some changes, and we're going to need to update the model so that we can model those additional ancillary services provided by storage resources, which are particularly well suited to be able to provide that kind of fast regulation type service.
Okay, also from Sonia, how deep is the reg market? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. And then the follow-up was how deep is the reg bucket?
In our annual report, so I'd refer you there. We do publish stats on the typical requirements for regulation. Regulation up and down. We've seen an increase, and so that it does vary day to day. Particularly, we're seeing slightly higher regulation requirements when there's a lot of renewable capacity or renewable variability expected online. But still, overall, the regulation requirements tend to be between 300 and 500 megawatts on a normal day.
Okay, one last question from Kelly. Do you have a sense of how often the resources were awarded energy and regulation in scenario 2?
In scenario 2, the analysts that ran scenario 2 compared the results of those awards to the sort of average schedules that we saw for participating resources. And what he saw there is that the schedules for those hypothetical resources were fairly close to the schedules that we're seeing for actual participating resources. Thank you to Pat Prendergast, who is an analyst in DMM, who texted me the answer to Dave Francis's question. He says CPM data is on page 268 of the report, and there was about 935 megawatts of CPM capacity for the system in 2020. Thank you, Pat. I said in the beginning, this is the work of a very dedicated team, and I appreciate that. All right. Moving on to the Western energy imbalance market, something we've been saying for a long time and definitely proved to be true in 2020 is that the existence of the energy imbalance market really did help improve the overall structure and performance of the real-time market. Part of what we're seeing in these instances where there are increases in the sort of extreme demand period is that the energy imbalance market allows transfers of power from one area of the market to another. We had 2 new EIM members join in 2020, Seattle City Light and SRP, and we had 5 new members join in 2021. The map on the left shows an additional set of entities joining in 2022, Avista, BPA, and Tucson, and an additional entrant in 2023 with El Paso Electric. The EIM, and this was actually true in 2019 as well, including the ISO, now accounts for over half of total WEC peak load. We have some very standard pricing patterns that we see quite often. One of them is that prices in the northwestern area, and this is not Northwestern Energy, but overall in the northwestern areas of the ISO, so Seattle City Light, Puget Sound Energy, PowerX, also Portland General, tend to be lower than the rest of the system, particularly in peak hours, and that is due to limited transfer capability. Another pattern that we see quite often is that California area prices tend to exceed prices in other areas due to both the greenhouse gas compliance costs of energy that is deemed delivered to California, as well as congestion. The pattern we're starting to see is that prices in the southwest, when demand in sort of extreme conditions in the Southwest can exceed prices in California, just as prices at Palo Verde can exceed prices at the SP15 hub and the bilateral market. This chart breaks down average prices for 2020 at the load aggregation points for San Diego Gas and Electric, SCE, PG&E, as well as the load aggregation points across the EIM into several components. And the overall average price is shown in the line at the top as the sum of the various components. The first component is the system-wide energy price. This is essentially the same in all areas, except that SRP and Seattle City Light, SCL, joined partway through the year, and so their average price is a little bit higher. To that system-wide energy price is added transmission losses, shown a relatively small fraction shown in black, congestion within the CAISO, so that's within the California ISO footprint, shown in yellow, congestion on EIM transfer limits, shown in red, and the contribution from the EIM greenhouse gas component shown here in green. I'll start with the EIM greenhouse gas component. What that component does when it is binding is create higher prices in California and lower prices outside of California. It's calculated in the market as a price reduction for areas outside. That green quantity is then paid to participating resources in order to compensate them for ultimately the compliance cost of being deemed delivered to California. So that is passed back to the EIM participating resources that were bidding into the California greenhouse gas to be deemed delivered to the state of California. Similarly, congestion on EIM transfer limits. So that's congestion, the cost of congestion on those limits is paid back to the participating transmission owners that brought that resource, that transmission resource, into the market. So the red components also, although shown as a reduction in the cost to load in some of those areas are also paid back to the transmission owners of those resources.
Not to interrupt, Jeff Tuturi was wondering, is that slide for day-ahead prices?
This is shown for average 15-minute prices. Our day-ahead market includes only the CAISO footprint. The 15-minute market and 5-minute market extend across the energy imbalance market. So that's what we're showing here. This chart shows two slides. Both of these have to do with the treatment of greenhouse gas compliance costs within the energy imbalance market. The slide on the left shows average greenhouse gas prices in our 15-minute market, shown in blue, and in the and the 5-minute market, shown in green, in the line. And then it shows the average quantities, incremental, that are deemed delivered in the 15-minute market, which is a positive number, and it tends to be lower in the 5-minute market. So the incremental delivery in the 5-minute market is then lower in green. You can see on the chart, which goes all the way back monthly to 2018, is there was a change in November of 2018. That change was a change to the requirements for bidding greenhouse gas, bidding the potential to be deemed delivered to the state of California and have that compliance obligation, and limiting the amount of capacity that was available to be bid in to the capacity above base scheduled megawatts. After that happened, you can see a dramatic increase in prices, up to about $8 really, in the 15-minute market. Looking on average for 2019 to 2020, what we see is that much of the greenhouse gas being delivered to California, as shown in blue, is hydro. There is a tiny bit of coal on occasion, and then natural gas. So the way the market works is in any particular interval, if the market is clearing, it clears against the supply curve, a total system-wide supply curve. Bids are capped at estimated maximum compliance costs, so the hydro resources are forced to bid in based on their emissions rate at 0, and gas resources would bid in at a positive cost. So if the gas resources are deemed delivered, they would then set the greenhouse gas price, and ultimately all resources being deemed delivered in that particular interval would be paid potentially the natural gas clearing bid. We have, starting in 2019, started to see intervals on occasion, and these are not very frequent, where the clearing price in the energy imbalance market for greenhouse gas is clearing above the highest cleared bid. And we do have charts on that in the report. I'll just note that we calculate the EIM revenue, so the total dollars that are paid back to potentially compensate for this compliance cost. And in 2020, that was about $35.7 million, which was about the same as it was in 2019. This chart is looking at monthly average 15-minute market prices going back to 2019. And I know it's probably been a few minutes, but if you can remember back to the gas chart at the beginning of the presentation, you see that there's a little bit of a bump in prices back in February of 2019 that was really associated with, again, those higher natural gas prices in that interval. When we look at August of 2020, we see high prices in NV Energy, as well as Arizona Public Service, Salt River Project, and Pacific Gas and Electric representing the ISO. We see lower prices on average for PowerX, shown in dark green, PacWest, Puget Sound Energy, Portland General Electric, and Seattle City Light, really representing that northwestern area. And I am just responding to an earlier question we got from Kelly. Kelly, if you would refer to the report, the exact answer to your question is shown on, I believe, page 84. So thank you to Sai Kalu for answering that question for me. All right. Moving on, this table shows average frequency of congestion on EIM transfer constraints. The asterisks for Salt River Project and Seattle City Light are because they're only participating for part of the year. Otherwise, this is shown as an average over the entire year in both the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. What you can see in the chart, and this is consistent with years past, is relatively high frequencies, getting up to close to 50% of intervals for PowerX, as well as high frequencies in the remainder of that northwestern part of the EIM system. Otherwise, what we tend to see is that there is relatively little congestion across and little price separation between the remainder of the system. When we take a look at congestion more generally, one of the other dramatic features of 2020 was an increase in congestion on major interties. This is showing the total congestion on selected interties, which tend to be constrained in our day-ahead market. It shows really an increase in congestion on Malin, Knob, and a decrease in congestion on Palo Verde and some of our the remainder of our other interties. We found that congestion on these interties accounted for a higher percentage of total congestion rent in the day-ahead market. So we're seeing congestion both within the EIM and then additionally outside of the EIM on interties in our day-ahead market, also from the northwest, coming south, either through the ISO to the southwest and the rest of the system, or into the ISO. When we take a broader look at congestion, this is showing the average day-ahead impact. So, and it's the day-ahead market, so we're showing the largest CLAPs, largest load aggregation points in the ISO, PG&E, SCE, and San Diego, showing the average impact of congestion in the day-ahead market. You can see dramatic increase in Q3, reducing prices in PG&E, shown in green, and increasing prices in the two southern areas. Congestion revenues, so total congestion rent, totaled about 6% of total day-ahead market energy costs, which again is about 90% of the total cost, compared to about 4.3% in 2019 and 6.8% back in 2018. Congestion revenue rights are financial rights to the price difference between two nodes, so to the congestion rent. And we found that transmission rate payers lost over $70 million from auction CRRs in 2020. That's up from about $22 million in 2019, but significantly down from $131 million in 2018. The chart is showing in blue the auction revenues, so the amounts received from selling these rights in the auction process, and then the payments out of the market back to those auction CRRs. Effective in January of 2019, the ISO implemented some significant changes to the CRR auction process. These changes were implemented in response to systematic losses from congestion revenue right auction sales since 2009. Essentially, there were two sets of changes. One is to limit the sets of nodes that are available for congestion revenue rights, and the second change is really to limit the amount that can be paid out on any pair of nodes to the total congestion. Those two changes together have significantly lowered transmission rate pair losses, but DMM believes that the current auction as it exists is unnecessary and could be eliminated, or if the ISO believes it's necessary for hedging, replaced with a market of willing buyers and sellers. And we find that losses from auction rights are about 14% of day-ahead congestion revenue, compared to 6% in 2019, but 21% in 2018. I'll stop here for questions before I move on.
Nothing in the text.
Thank you.
We do have a question in the phone queue. Alrighty, caller, your line's being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about these metrics. This is Seth from DC Energy. Just in the overall scheme of things, I understand CAISO is looking at this from the ISO's market perspective, not looking at the greater impacts, the exogenous benefits to the greater market. And I wanted to ask the DMM if they've seen the PJM report that was independent and conducted by London Economics. Have you seen that? And it observed that the exogenous benefits are on the order of 400% compared to these much smaller amounts that you're showing here. Has the DMM read that? Do you acknowledge that there are those benefits? And how does that factor into the ratepayer loss calculation?
Thanks for the question, Seth. This is a calculation, a fairly direct calculation of the ratepayer losses. We're not attempting in this to capture any kind of exogenous benefit from hedging.
Okay. Do you think that the slide could be annotated to reflect that, or at least that would be an important contribution to that slide or acknowledgement?
I think the measurement of that exogenous hedging, that I think what you're referring to is really a benefit in terms of hedging, and that would be, I think, a fairly subjective measure. So I really prefer.
Have you read the report? Have you read the report?
Personally, I have not.
Okay. I don't think it's subjective. I'd encourage you to read it.
Okay. We will, though, I think, continue to report this as is, and it's really a very consistent tracking of losses and losses of value to the transmission, the owners of that transmission through the auction process. One interesting note I'll just add here is that the losses in 2020 were a little bit different than some of the losses that we've seen in 2019 and 2018. About 36 million of the total, so that's a little over half of the total losses for the year, came in this third quarter and were the result of a relatively small number of load-serving entities selling their allocated rights, because there's a process that the ISO uses to allocate rights, selling those allocated rights back in the auction. And that is what accounted for over half of the losses in 2020. And Seth, I just challenge you a little bit. I do take the note, but to consider, how one would measure the possible benefits of a market of willing buyers and sellers, if such a thing should exist, and that has been consistently DMM's recommendation.
Yeah. And, hey, Seth, this is Eric Hildebrand. I'll just chime in. So, if the benefits are so great of hedging, then I think we've recommended the ISO should just run a market between willing buyers and sellers for hedging, eliminate the CRRs and just replace it with a straightforward hedging market if the benefits of that are so great.
Okay. I mean, if you read the report, you'd understand the liquidity driven to get those benefits comes from having hedges sold in the network configuration. So to separate the two is not quite the way that would work or play out in the real world.
Okay. Well, you know what? Shoot us that report. We'll be glad to look at it.
Will do.
Okay. Yep.
Thanks, Seth.
All right, we have no more questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Yeah, so just to keep some of the numbers in mind, total losses for CRRs were about $70 million in 2020. Total imbalance offset costs increased to $177 million, so almost $100 million higher. Most of that was congestion offset costs at $117 million, and most of those congestion offset costs were due to reductions in constraint limits between day-ahead and real-time market. If you are interested, we have a quarterly report from 2018 and Q3, which really explains how those consistent reductions in limits can generate congestion offset costs, and I recommend that to anybody. We also saw an increase in the energy offset cost to about $64 million, and that was concentrated in our high load days when we had very high prices in the market. So it really comes from very high energy offset costs on a small number of days. Ancillary service costs were only about $20 million higher than energy offset costs, but that was an overall increase, and increase both in dollars and in as a percent of overall wholesale energy costs, so increasing to about a little over about 2.2% of overall wholesale energy costs. Those cost increase were driven by both increase in the opportunity costs of providing those ancillary services, so they're correlated with some of the higher energy costs that we saw, as well as an increase in requirements for both operating reserve spin and non-spin, as well as an increase in our regulation requirements. Bid cost recovery payments in the CAISO increased to $126 million, about 1.4% of total energy costs, but only a moderate increase from 2019, which is $123 million. As one would expect, highest in the months when our energy costs were higher, so higher in August and September. Overall, energy from exceptional dispatches decreased in 2020 and accounted for a low portion of system load, so less than about 0.5%. Cost decreased to $16 million from $26 million, so very, very low cost of exceptional dispatch. Those costs, to preemptively answer a question, do not include the cost of any capacity procured in response to an exceptional dispatch as part of the CAISO's backstop capacity procurement mechanism. So we do see monthly CPM designations, sometimes even for a longer 60-day period, which can be triggered by exceptional dispatch. We do not include those costs in our estimate. One of the other operator actions that we've seen very consistently, and this continues to be true in 2021, is the use of what I call here load adjustments, otherwise called imbalance conformance. These remained high in both our hour-ahead and 15-minute market. They're shown for 2020 in red, 2019 in blue, and 2018 in green. We're showing the same values for the 5-minute market in the same 3 years in the dashed sort of dotted lines below. You can see that increase in 2019 for the hour-ahead and 15-minute market really stayed in place, got slightly higher in 2020 in the peak hours of the day, so up to about 1,000 megawatts. This, to me, is tied to a discussion of the flexible ramping product. The flexible ramping product exists in our real-time market, so it is designed to account for and meet uncertainty between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market, or between 5-minute intervals. It is designed to enhance reliability, and I think there was a hope that it would replace the use of some of the operator actions that we see pretty consistently in the market. There has been a stakeholder process to change the flexible ramping market to account for some of the unavailable capacity which is used to meet requirements in the design today. Going back several years, we've seen that some capacity which is not capable of meeting the system requirements, so say stranded in the northwest behind transmission constraints, is then dispatched to meet those flexible ramping products, so gets the awards for flexible ramping products. So we tend to see prices at zero. Going back to November of 2020, the ISO implemented an interim step in the transition from the existing market design, which has essentially system requirements, to a more nodal market design by implementing balancing area limits, so balancing area constraints in the flexible ramping product, which apply under certain conditions. That was implemented in the 15-minute market for the 15-minute product, but not in the 5-minute market. And towards the end, so for the last 2 months of 2020 and for the first 3 months of 2021, we saw that the area-specific constraint was binding frequently for the California ISO particularly, and in intervals for other areas. We do see system-level prices that are very frequently zero in over 99% of intervals in the 5-minute market, and in most intervals when the area-specific constraints are not applied in the 15-minute market. Total uncertainty payments to generators decreased to only $4.6 million, so substantially below ancillary services or offset costs or any number of other things. And it's been a steady decrease since 2017. So DMM really supports the ISO stakeholder process to refine the product, particularly procurement of capacity from resources that are able to meet system uncertainty, and to redesign the product so that it is supply is capable of meeting that requirement. Because the design today allows procurement of capacity from resources that are not available, this can reduce the effectiveness of the product to manage net load volatility and prevent power balance constraint violations. The second recommendation that DMM has had consistently through many reports has been that the flexible ramping product, the ISO should consider redesigning the flexible ramping product to account for uncertainty over both load and future availability of resources to meet load over a longer time period. We've seen that dealing with that uncertainty over a longer time period has really contributed to operators needing to enter systematic and large imbalance conformance adjustments. And we see those adjustments in both the hour ahead and 15-minute market, as I showed on the last slide, as well as in our residual unit commitment process in the day ahead market. this is a good point to stop for questions if there are any questions on the phone or in the chat.
You do have a chat from Sumya. Do you know if there has been decreased conformance since the use of the high confidence forecast?
I think Samya, this is Samya Sastry from PG&E asking whether or not we've seen a decreased use of the residual unit commitment adjustment, which the ISO has sometimes called the high confidence forecast. And have we seen a reduced use of imbalance conformance in the hour-ahead market since the residual unit commitment adjustments went in place? I will say, actually, we've been reporting on the use of operator adjustments in RUC, which have been significant and have grown significantly over the last 3 years and have been in place. And over that same time period, we've seen an increased use in the hour-ahead adjustment. I will just take a moment because I don't think I have a slide on. I don't think I have a slide that includes the effect of the RUC adjustments on the requirement. There is a nice set of slides in the report. To note here that the ISO is publishing today some metrics, public metrics, on the high confidence load forecast, which we call operator adjustments to RUC requirement. And that is being published on the ISO's website now on an ongoing basis, so that everyone can see. Are there any other questions on that?
We do have a question in the verbal queue. Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Ian White with Shell Energy. I may have missed the discussion on this, but I would like to go back to slide 34. Couple of quick questions. First, is this chart, is this a average across all months of the year for, sorry about that, you cut out there.
Yes, it is. So it's an average over all months of the year. But we have versions of this chart for each of our quarterly reports. So if you want to see what it looks like on a quarterly basis, we have that as well.
Okay. Okay, great. And one of the questions I have about this is sort of just a question about any sort of feedback loop effects. Operator adjustments or manual interventions sort of, I think, as evidenced in the chart here, lead to price divergence between IFM, FMM, and RTPD markets. And I wondered if DMM or the ISO anywhere has studied kind of a best guess of would there be more price convergence between markets absent operator intervention or manual adjustment?
It's an interesting question. I will say that one of the reasons that we cite for the lack of convergence between the 5-minute market price and the 15-minute market price is the difference and the persistent difference between imbalance conformance in those markets, which you can see on this chart. There is also, and I unfortunately don't have a slide on it, in the ISO's market there is a convergence bidding process which allows financial arbitrage between the day-ahead market, IFM, and the 15-minute market. And overall for the year on average we see fairly tight convergence between the hour-ahead and 15-minute, between the day-ahead and 15-minute market.
Okay.
Also note on this chart, partially because you asked, that the ISO operators are not the only operators in the energy imbalance market that use imbalance conformance tools. Those are also used by other areas in our energy imbalance market, and we report, actually as required by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, report out a table in each quarterly report which summarizes the use of imbalance conformance by EIM balancing area, so that you can see both the sort of average values as well as kind of as a percent of their load.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And so I guess just to make sure I understand, when you discuss imbalance conformance, and in the report, one of the reasons you call out sort of a divergence in general prices between the FMM and the real-time 5-minute market. If I understand that correctly, one of the reasons you identify is sort of operator load conformance or bias or imbalance conformance, whatever name you want to call it, and absent some of that, DMM would expect more price convergence between FMM and 5-minute markets. Is that kind of an accurate or fair restatement, just from my understanding?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay, great.
Actually,
sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
What you're seeing here in the imbalance conformance is that on a systematic basis, it's adding demand up to about 1,000 megawatts in our hour-ahead and 15-minute markets and the highest price hours of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, from our perspective, kind of the manual intervention in that way, while certainly, having reliability benefits, does have market impacts. And so, to the extent that DMM or the rest of the CAISO staff could potentially quantify that, I think that would be really helpful, just to kind of understand some of the impacts for generators or scheduling coordinators or resources that may have exposure to IFM, FMM, and real-time 5-minute market sort of price divergence.
Yeah,
and
sorry, I was going to jump in. This issue was, this has been comes up over the years, and I guess it's been 3 years now. The ISO, this was a big issue. The MSC recommended the ISO look at it, as well as DMM. The ISO did a big report on pricing in the real-time market. It was a big initiative and put out a lot of stuff. I think their conclusion was they weren't able to go through in a meaningful way to go through the exercise of trying to come up with a counterfactual price. But I would refer you to that report and that process, which looked at precisely the issue you're talking about, the sources of divergence in prices in their real-time and day-ahead market.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will certainly take a look at that. I think, considering just this chart shows that through time its use is certainly more pronounced on a yearly average, certainly in the evening hours and the morning ramp hours. Perhaps, even if we can't calculate what the price would have been, it seems to me we all, the stakeholder group, and I think, I'm not sure about DMM, but CAISO, I think, through various initiatives has really signaled that they want to move away from load bias or imbalance conformance, and I think that one of the reasons for that is maybe just some of those feedback loops that I talked about between market prices.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll just tie that to one of our big recommendations is to extend the horizon of the flexible ramping product beyond, just 10 or 30 minutes. That's not enough, to set up and preserve ramping capacity. Instead, the operators continue to exceptionally dispatch units, position them up toward the evening ramp, start ramping them up to exceptional dispatch, and then biasing the hour ahead forecast. So it's doing all those manual interventions. I think everybody agrees they would prefer to come up with a market mechanism to reduce those. The FRP is designed to help with that, but we think, it's a 10 or a 15 or 30-minute lookout the operators start taking these actions well before that. So we think extending the time horizon of the flexible ramping product, to 2 to 4 hours, so that it would position units before the evening ramp. We think that would help. So we're focused kind of on things you could do about it versus, trying to quantify the impact. I think everybody agrees it has an impact, and it would be desirable to reduce it.
Yeah, that point is certainly well taken. It's, we all, I guess, agree that we want to move beyond it. We just need to work on a market mechanism to do so. That leads me into the second part of my question. You don't have to go back to the slide because it's way back on slide 4. But since we're talking about prices and IFM prices, I wanted to just anecdotally get DMM's view on what, if there is, again, sort of an unintentional feedback loop, is persistent high IFM prices, does that, in DMM's view, create kind of the incentive to perhaps underschedule your load in real time? Because you see on a pretty widespread basis that real-time prices, be they FMM or RT prices, are certainly lower than IFM. And so I just wanted to kind of get DMM's view on that.
Well, that's a virtual bidding. We do have virtual bidding, and that's in theory what that would address. I think what we find is virtual bidding probably helps reduce that difference because, we do see typically a net virtual supply. And that would, or net virtual demand, depending on the hours, and it does tend to drive the prices closer, but, virtual bidding, if the prices were driven equal, then there would be no profit in virtual bidding. So kind of our theory is there's virtual bidders are out to make a profit, and, they'll move prices in the right direction up to a point, but, they want a spread that's profitable. So virtual bidding helps to that extent. And, one of the reasons for virtual bidding is to offset the potential impact of, load underscheduling.
And I guess one of the things, and this may not be the, DMM may not be the best group to ask, but what's DMM's view on, to soak up, if you will, some of this divergence in price? Would it be appropriate perhaps for the CAISO to create a second tranche of convergence bidding products that allow you to try and converge the FMM and real-time price? Would that maybe help?
No. That virtual bidding started, and that was highly problematic. So I would refer you back to the first year that we had virtual bidding and what that happened. So that created different sets of problems.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Kick it back to you, Amanda. Yep.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'll just note, I think the ISO is hoping that with the implementation of nodal FRP, which should be coming, I think, in the spring of 2022, that with a more effective flexible ramping product, they might see a reduction in the use of those imbalanced conformants by operations. Also on load underscheduling, there's a discussion of that in our report on the August and September high demand period, which is available on the website if you're interested. This chart is showing our competitiveness. It's one of the things we look at is the competitiveness of the day-ahead market. We do that by rerunning the day-ahead market with no changes and replicating it, and then comparing that to a case where we run under a competitive scenario. This year, it's a little bit of a different scenario, and I can talk about that if you're interested, but what we see is overall a total markup that is shown in red of about $1 per megawatt hour on average across the year, so about 2.5%. So overall, very competitive market results. and I'm speeding up here because even with 2 hours, I've got about 15 slides left. Overall, we saw a reduction in the structural competitiveness of the market. This chart is showing the number of hours for which the residual supply index, either 1, 2, or 3, is less than 1, going all the way back to 2016. And the table at the top is showing the total number of hours with the residual supply index less than 1 in each of those years. The residual supply index is explained in the report, but essentially what that is a comparison of the ratio of available supply to demand minus either the largest pivotal supplier, the 2 largest, or the 3 largest pivotal suppliers. So what you can see is an increase in the number of hours that are structurally uncompetitive gradually over the whole period, but really increasing in 2020. One of the notes that we make in our annual report regularly is that state policy creates the basis for competitive market outcomes. Currently, and this is part of what I was talking about in the beginning, California relies on a long-term procurement, planning, and resource adequacy requirements that are placed on load-serving entities by the California Public Utility Commission. And that really ensures that sufficient capacity is available to meet system and local reliability requirements. CPUC policies have a major impact on the type of different generating resources that are on the system and on the new resources that are added to the ISO system. The load shift from investor-owned utilities to community choice aggregators changes some of the bidding requirements that are placed on capacity that is managed by those load-serving entities. And also we've seen a decrease in the long-term capacity contracts held by load-serving entities. This chart, and I realize that the font may be kind of small, shows for the 210 highest load hours, shows the availability of resource adequacy capacity. So this is based on the daily showing of resource adequacy capacity, and then shows how much of that capacity was available in the day-ahead market, how much bid into the day-ahead market, how much was available in the real-time market, and how much bid into the real-time market in the final column. One of the things that you can see on this chart, and one of the things I'd like you to take away from this chart, is that the majority of resource adequacy capacity in 2020 in these hours was use limited. Falls in a number of different categories there, but it's a real change in our system. Overall availability was high, at about 90% of that capacity overall bidding in our day-ahead market in those hours, and 88% bidding in the real-time market. I will run through this, and then I saw a question pop up in the chart. The key findings of our August and September heat wave report are really consistent with the joint report published by the CAISO, CPUC, and CEC. One, extreme temperatures and energy demand across the West. Resource adequacy requirements, which were based on the median 1- and 2-year loads plus a 15% planning reserve margin, which was insufficient in that high demand period. Counting rules for resource adequacy capacity, which overestimated actual capacity that's available from some resources during the early evening hours. A limit in transmission capacity from the Pacific Northwest, which actually got derated down by about 650 megawatts as a result of weather-related outages. Sudden loss of several large gas-fired units. Self-scheduling of relatively large volume of exports in the day-ahead market. And that to get to the question that came up before, is where the analysis of underscheduling of load came in the day-ahead market, because the underscheduling of load in the day-ahead market by load-serving entities potentially allowed higher volumes of that of economic export bids to clear in that market. And finally, residual unit commitment process and related real-time bid processing design that allowed exports clearing in the day-ahead market to receive a very high scheduling priority in the real-time market. This chart is showing on the particularly high load days, so the days of load curtailment were August 14th and 15th. This is showing in the day-ahead market all of our bids from resource adequacy by fuel type compared to IFM forecast in the day-ahead shown in black, that forecast plus reserve requirement shown in yellow and the dotted purple, depending on which ancillary services you include. And then on top of that, the addition of self-scheduled, that's what the SS stands for, exports. You can see that on the days of load curtailment, resource adequacy bids in the day-ahead market were high enough to meet the IFM forecast, but not to meet the additional demand on the system created by those exports plus ancillary services. Same as sort of equivalent shown in the real-time market on the right-hand side of the screen. And I will run through this slide and then stop for questions. I also took some steps to ensure that exports were limited to physically feasible levels. The first thing that happened, and this was quite a dramatic event, is that virtual bidding was suspended effective August 18th. And then I think in one of the biggest changes to the market that we saw in 2020, effective September 5th, the ISO made important changes to the residual unit commitment process, RUC, and real-time scheduling priority. And the change that they made limited day-ahead market energy export schedules to those that were physically feasible in RUC. And only those that were feasible in RUC were passed into the real-time market as the high day-ahead scheduling priority. Under current design, the ISO's current policy is still to prioritize exports that are physically feasible in RUC and receive day-ahead RUC awards to prioritize those over native CAISO balancing area load in real time. And the rules and processes for limiting or curtailing exports used by the CAISO and other balancing areas should be reviewed, clarified, and potentially modified with the goal of establishing equal treatment and expectations for exports by all balancing areas. We really had 4 recommendations that came out of our analysis of this period that are emphasized in our annual report and I think are really important. One is that the resource adequacy requirements should more accurately reflect the increased risk of these extreme weather events and the correlated nature of that as well. Second, really to work with stakeholders to clarify and revise resource adequacy capacity counting rules, particularly for some of the use-limited resources, for instance, water, hydro, demand response, imports, some of our variable energy resources as well. Third, that the CAISO work with other BAs to discuss and clarify rules around curtailment of exports. In the interim, we supported the market enhancements for summer 2021 reliability, which are in place today, and as well the ISO we support the existence of the stakeholder process, which the ISO kicked off in July of this year, called External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Process Initiative. And finally, our last and fourth, I think, major recommendation that came out of the analysis of the conditions this summer, this being the summer of 2020, was that the ISO take steps to ensure that a higher portion of demand response, shown as resource adequacy, be available during critical net load hours. And with that, I will stop for questions.
All right, I do see that we have one on the phone. you. Alrighty. Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Amelia, this is Michelle Keeter from the CPC. I just had a couple of questions. On page 42, you say CAISO's current policy is still to prioritize exports that receive day-ahead REC awards. I thought with the changes that were approved by FERC that that's not the case. Even if it gets a REC award, if it's a low priority or an economic export, it could be pulled back in the real time.
My understanding is that under the current market design, physically feasible exports in RUC still receive the high day-ahead scheduling priority.
Okay. That was not my understanding because I thought the change they made was to get rid of that. Okay. Well, I'll follow up with CAISO directly about that one because that was not my understanding. So, because I thought it got like a $5 penalty price in the day ahead, but they got rid of that penalty price with the PRR change that went into effect with the new FERC ruling. Okay, that's one question. And then with regard to DR, you said your recommendation is to make DR more available in the real time. Can DR be committed in RUC? Is that maybe one of the changes one could make?
That's an interesting suggestion. We have seen an increase in registration of demand response resources that do need to be committed well in advance of the real-time market. And one of the ways and we have seen actually demand response that can be committed by RUC. That RUC commitment comes with a real-time bidding obligation, so it's a requirement that it be available in the real-time market. Overall, this is going through sort of August and September of 2020, so our high demand period. We found about 4% of RA requirements were met by demand response, and about a third of that was not available.
Okay. 1/3 not available. Okay, and then one additional question. Earlier on, you were showing the figures about the RA not meeting the requirements for August and September. Did that include the above RA? So let's say wind or solar was generating more than their RA requirement during that period of time, or do you guys cap it at the RA amount?
These figures are capped at the RA amount.
Okay, so even if solar, the RA amount would be 15%, and during the day they were generating more, it doesn't include it. But you guys do have figures where it shows the above RA, right?
We do. We included those figures in our analysis in our heat wave report. Those are not in the annual report. And I am. I got a nice comment from Christy Sonata in DMM who says that long start PDR, so it's one form of the demand response, is not required to be in RUC. But
Okay. So that's one possibility.
But other long start resource adequacy is, and that DMM is recommending that the ISO remove the exemption for long start. Long start PDR.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, and we do not have any additional callers in the queue at this time.
You have a few texts from Ian White regarding periods where LMPs are $0 in any market. Does DMM have a view as to why LMPs across many, if not all, price nodes will be 0 or 1 penny? One would expect to see different prices between those.
So we'll say we have, over the years, included a lot of coverage of low and negative prices. We do tend to see those exactly when you would expect to see them in the market, which is when the market is clearing with bids from, we actually sometimes have negative bids from economically participating capacity, particularly our renewables. So in periods where our net load is low, we do tend to see an increase in negative prices. That was the case here. In the interest of time, I'm going to get through the next 3 slides and then take questions after that. This is just a very high-level summary of our key recommendations. If you are interested, I would urge you to read the report and definitely contact us if you have some suggested reading or any questions at all. The first is that the ISO enhanced the flexible ramping product, implementing locational procurement or otherwise further modified to address uncertainty over that longer time horizon. And the hope is that doing so would allow operators to reduce reliance on some of that imbalanced conformance that we've seen systematically. We have a second recommendation around system market power mitigation. That's been delayed until Q4 of 2021, and it's been tied to a discussion of scarcity pricing provisions. We urge the ISO to consider being able to implement some sort of system market power mitigation should that be deemed necessary. And we have some notes of caution around the tie to any increase in scarcity pricing. We have a set of recommendations around export and wheeling schedules, which we've discussed slightly, EIM resource sufficiency tests, which is a major issue today in our energy imbalance market, demand response resources and their treatment, and flexibility, resource adequacy requirements from a planning perspective, as well as storage resources and their behavior in the market. I'll say that the CPUC, and thank you both Michelle and Mike for all of your questions today, has identified a lot of options for addressing issues and is moving forward with the more detailed kind of market design on those options and decisions. I listed a number of those here. DMM really supports these efforts and views the options being considered by the CPUC as potentially effective steps. And I will repeat that it is that state planning that provides the basis for the competitive market results that we see for the California ISO VA. And finally, we have a set of recommendations around resource adequacy and capacity procurement. The first is really to modify and clarify resource adequacy import requirements. One of the changes made by the CPUC was a requirement that increased availability in our real-time market by requiring bids essentially at or below zero. That applies to CPUC jurisdictional, but not more broadly within resource adequacy imports in the CAISO market. And our goal there is to really ensure availability in the day-ahead and real-time markets. Second, to limit and manage reliance on energy and availability limited resources. As I mentioned, we've got over half of the resource adequacy fleet is use limited now, and particular concerns around demand response, battery resources, which may not be available, and capacity ratings for intermittent resources. And finally, a set of recommendations around resource adequacy performance incentives. The incentive in place today called RAW AIM, Resource Adequacy Availability Incentive Mechanisms, is designed to incent bidding. It is not designed to incent being actual performance in the market, so metered performance. It's not based on metered generation in the market. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any additional questions. And I will thank the market participant who suggested that we allow for an additional hour because it looks like we needed it.
Nothing in the chat.
I'm not seeing any additional questions on the phone.
All right. With that, thank you very much for your time. There's a lot more in the report than I was able to present today. So I do encourage you to read it. The link again is at the beginning of the screen. And additionally, if there is any kind of metric that you think would be really useful or just a discussion you would like to have, please feel free to contact us and let us know. With that, thank you very much for your time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.